All right. Hey, everybody. It's Coach Matt from Compound Performance. I think one of the things that I'm going to start doing, in addition to starting to put some more content out on YouTube and some more informational content out on Instagram, is I'm going to start chronicling my meet prep, right? So I'm prepping for a meet on June 11th. And one of the things that I'm looking for and looking to do with this and have people to get out of this is an understanding of the way that my program is structured and why it's programmed out and structured the way that it is. So if we're going to break down my split, I train 5 days per week: Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. My Monday day 1 is a lighter squat. My Tuesday day 2 is a heavier bench. My Thursday day 3 is a primary heavy squat. Friday day 4 is a lighter secondary bench, which we'll cover in depth during this video a little bit more on why it's not a lighter bench right now. And Saturday, day 5, is my deadlift day, right? So right now I'm only pulling once per week, I'm benching twice per week, and I'm squatting twice per week. And there's a reason behind all of the stuff that we're doing, right? So if we're looking at this, the structure of my program, day 1 having a lighter squat day, what we're using this one for is I'm using this as a skill builder and a load limiter for my 3rd squat day, particularly with me because I am a bit not confident with my squat technique and my squat output in general. That is because I've had multiple injuries during squatting, right? So most recently in 2020, I tore my adductor on my right leg adductor doing a 405 warm-up squat when I was supposed to be working up to about a 550 single on that day. So it was like not even close to anything that was actually heavy. It's just one of those ones where it doesn't necessarily always work for me, so I want to have as much practice as I can to allow me to be very skillful. But the problem with this is I also recover fairly poorly from squats because I'm taller and I have a lot longer range of motion to cover, so we have to look at the way we can structure this and the way that we can wave it out. So usually what's going to work best for me is having a very low exposure and a very high exposure, right? So having a large difference between the two. Bench ends up being about the same because I do have a larger bench and I do have a longer range of motion that I'm going to be pressing over. We're going to have that same kind of exposure net where we're looking at one low, one high. And then deadlift, I'm either going to deadlift once or twice a week, depending on the week. And that's going to be either a very high and low exposure or one just high-end exposure to begin with. This is something that we're going to be talking about later on as I start covering other people's preps where people are benching and squatting and doing things 3-4 times per week, because what we would have to look at there is that gap between high and low output is going to have to narrow, right? So we're going to have to allow that to become a little bit more consistent to let people just recover in between. So we're not just consistently overshooting, right? So we're actually going to make a post about that on social media this week. So getting started with this week, my day 1 lighter squat session. What I'm going to look at here is we've got 3 videos that we've recorded. Now I do have to record this video on Microsoft Edge because Google Chrome is having an issue with Apple right now where they're not allowing .move files to play. But fortunately, Microsoft Edge doesn't really care and they're kind of unbiased in this, so we can get the videos to load. So with this is my lighter squat day. I have a couple triples at 451. What I'm looking to do here is I'm just trying to make sure that the path moves well and the technique is relatively sound, right? So I'm relatively happy with the technique of these ones. I'm not happy with the last rep on each of these. I had slept fairly poorly going into this, and one of the things that I was noticing is when I sleep poorly going into a session, my skill and my technique kind of suffers a little bit more. My output is usually totally fine. I end up being a little bit more capacity based at that point, so my top end strength ends up being a little bit lower, and my lower end strength and my lower end capacity work ends up being pretty fine. So even though this last rep moved fairly poorly and fairly slowly, I ended up rating this at about an RPE 6 to 6.5 because I felt like I could very easily do another 7-8 reps out of this one, right? So again, I'm looking at this, rating it as about an RPE 6. Again, that's not a correct RPE based off of the number of reps that I thought I had in the tank, but what we're looking at is on my scale, it only goes to 6, so we're looking at that being the number, right? So if we're looking at this, it's another one where my sets did progressively get better over time. So on my this is my 3rd and final set. It ends up moving a little bit better and a little bit easier. And again, towards that last rep, it's another one that was moving fairly quick and fairly easily. And my technique was a little bit better. So looking at this from the first set to the 3rd set, there was a marked improvement in the execution of the movements on each one. which leads me to believe that it was more of a recovery-based thing and not necessarily the movement being poor, right? This is one of the reasons why data collection and looking at things like this is very important when you're looking at coaching powerlifters, because if I can see a marked improvement from set 1, 2, and 3 on a repeat day, what I can look at is, okay, cool, this person probably just wasn't really very well recovered going into the training session, and we can allow them to get a little bit better out of this. And then we can just get them to just work on building up their outside stuff and getting them to recover a little bit better. And then they will move better as they start going through it, right? Now, moving on to my accessories, I have a glute focused leg press, right, which I did with 315. So what we're looking at with here, is that my hips are going to be the prime mover of the movement. So my knees are going to move as a secondary bend, right? So the primary move is going to be coming from the hip joint, and then the knees are going to just be bending as a secondary result of the hip joint moving, right? So what I'm looking at this is on days when I'm not doing or on weeks when I'm not doing a secondary deadlift, I'm going to do a lot of glute focused leg presses because it ends up replicating the position of a conventional deadlift fairly similarly, particularly given the way that I do deadlifts, right? So when we look at my deadlift day, we'll see some of the videos. I believe I uploaded them, and we'll see how I deadlift, right? So my form is going to look similar to a leg press. And one of the biggest cues that I use with a lot of lifters, particularly with people with the deadlift bar, is to leg press the weight off the ground. So I use this one as a really, really easy way to just kind of drive and build that cue a little bit more. Then I just have a bunch of secondary back work, which, everybody likes a good back pump. Back is a strong muscle, and it's an important muscle for powerlifting, so we want to make sure that one is very strong. This day, this got a little bit reordered for some reason, but I ended up having to work up to a top single on bench at 308. Again, this is something that I rated at RPE 0, because if we look at the video, it's going to move at about an RPE 0. Again, this is about 140 pounds off of my current comp max, or 130 pounds off my current comp max, but this is very light because I tore my pec about 5 weeks ago, so we're looking at just kind of rehabbing and restructuring the pec and remodeling it a little bit more through some exposure to some movements, right? So I'm very happy with the execution of this. I'm also very happy with the fact that I stayed at 308 and didn't jump up. This week, I have a decent jump moving up to probably 315 to 341. Then I had some downset volume at 275, which again, last set shown here, moved super easily. One of the things that I am looking at doing here is I am looking at my elbows and my elbow position, right? So what we can see here is we can see that I do have a bit, like here my wrists and elbows are fairly well stacked, but as soon as I start to press, my elbows begin to flare a little bit, which is kind of showing me that I might not have a quite appropriate grip width. So what I'm going to experiment with this week, and I experimented with later on in this past week, is moving my hands out about a quarter of an inch. So I'm going to put, instead of pinkies being on the inside of the rings, my ring fingers are going to be on the rings, and we'll see how that goes for the remainder of prep. And again, it's just because of that little movement here, so we can just see it. If I just, I don't know if the frame rate can be low enough. Yeah, cool. But you can, right? So you can see this right here as my elbows start to flare. That's one of the things I'm looking at kind of eliminating. So what I'm going to try with that is a slightly wider grip and adjusting my touch point a little bit. Unfortunately, right now the bench is light enough that it's not going to really matter or make that big of a difference, but I can still see if this skill and the technique is executing the way that I want it to. Then I had a bunch of supersets on incline dumbbell press and press arounds, then some costal pec work, then some medial head tricep extensions with an AMRAP on the last one and an AMRAP on the last one of tricep extensions. And all these, again, they're just bench builders, and they're movements that are going to be specific to the way that I set up my bench, allowing me to just work a little bit more output, right? We're also focusing on working both the lengthened and the shortened position of my pec, particularly because the left one is partially torn. So I'm looking at just getting a nice pump in the pec, getting some more blood into the tissue, and allowing it to work on healing a little bit more. Day 3, I had a light squat day, which I only worked up to a 496 squat single, and then I worked up to a couple downset triple or sets of 4 at 374. So I didn't upload I thought I uploaded my top single, but apparently I did not. So they'll have to go with the downsets on this one. I was very happy with the execution of the downsets. Again, this is super light, and it was supposed to be fairly light. One of the things that I have swapped to recently is I've swapped to this grip that we're calling Talon Grip, right? So what a Talon Grip is where my pinky is going to be under the bar and I have 3 fingers over. So it's more of like a hook grip like this. So it ends up kind of almost looking like a bird's talon, right? So what I've done and what I've noticed with switching to Talon Grip is that my elbows stay under the bar a little bit easier, and it keeps the bar from sliding around my body as I go through the movement. So I like the way that this is looking, and I like the way that this feels. So we're going to keep going with it. In my last set, I ended up just trying to just pump it out. Everything moved really well. Very happy with how this day was executed. Things were very good. And again, more glute dominant leg press, worked up to a little bit heavier because the rep range was lower. Some leg extensions, maxing out the machine plus a green and yellow band. Some leg curls, 1 1/4 rep, and some leg curl full range of motion reps, and then some hip flexors and some dedicated glute work. Next day, working up to a 3 board press. One of the things that we're looking at with this is because my pec is torn, my secondary bench day is going to end up having to be slightly heavier because I want to be able to hold and have something in my hand that is heavier than I'm exposed to on a normal day, right? So again, this is about what my 6 or 7 rep full range of motion bench max was when I was going into this prep. So now that I can hit it for a set of 5 fairly comfortably off of 3 board, this is something that I'm looking at continuing to push and just allowing me to get that exposure and that neural exposure to heavier load, so I feel more comfortable going through the motions and going through the bench when it's time to full range of motion press again. Then here I finally got up to work to the 110s for some sets of 8 on the flat dumbbell bench, which is very far off of PR. So my best bench that I've done, or my best set of dumbbell bench, was 130 for 2 sets of 26 and 20. So this is significantly off of there, but it's finally getting to the point where it feels like I'm actually allowing the pec to contract and work again. Then it's just partnered up with some costal pec pressing again for the shortened position of the pecs. Then some anterior delt front raise presses and some anterior delt front raises with 35s. Then cable raises, 1 1/4 rep, and then full range of motion. Then some triceps on the rope, and then the machine bench. Now, this is also one of the things that I'm really liking that we're doing here, is just using a machine for a slightly different intention than you would normally do, right? So normally if I'm looking for pecs, what I'm going to look for is a machine that converges, and I'm going to look to have my humerus be the main driver, right? So my elbow is going to extend as a secondary mechanism to my humerus going through flexion and extension. But with this one, I'm actually lifting up my elbows and I'm trying to drive elbow extension and cue the elbow to extend, which is then going to allow the humerus to go into flexion, right? So I'm moving my position slightly differently and I'm focusing on more driving the elbows together as opposed to driving the humerus towards my midline like it would be on a normal bench press. So then there's being a little bit of a different intention here. Finally, on my last day, rehabbing a slight hamstring tweak, worked up to some cluster triples at 374, 440, and 484. This moved very, very easily. Dumbbell RDLs, it says barbell, but I did dumbbell instead because all of the platforms were taken and I didn't want to take them up to do RDLs. So I did some 200-pound RDLs for some sets of 8, paired this with some glute extensions at 130 because it's the biggest set of dumbbells that we have. Some leg press, and then some abs. Got it all done. Good training week. So this coming week, I have a heavier squat and a slightly heavier deadlift, pushing bench volume and intensity a little bit more as well as it's continuing to rehab and heal. Just want to continue pushing things. I'm about 7 weeks out of the meet at this point, and I'm still looking forward to hitting some good numbers on my squat, bench, and deadlift. I should be able to exceed my PR on both bench and deadlift by a bit. I was looking at exceeding them significantly, but now it should be down to just like 5 to 10 kilos over old PR. But keep following along and we'll keep it going. You guys will get the updates as they happen.